The wind howled across the desolate mountain pass, carrying with it the bitter scent of snow and something far more chilling, the sound of a woman's labored breathing echoing against the rocky walls. Judith Castillo pressed her back against the cold stone, her swollen belly straining against the thin fabric of her worn dress as she tried to steady herself. 8 months pregnant and abandoned on this God-forsaken trail, she had never felt more alone in her life. The men who had brought her here were already distant specks disappearing into the valley below, their cruel laughter still ringing in her ears like a death knell. This is what happens to women who bring shame upon their families. Her father's words echoed in her memory, each syllable a dagger to her heart. You will learn to survive on your own, or you will perish as you deserve. The baby kicked violently inside her, as if sensing the desperation that coursed through her veins. She placed a trembling hand over her belly, whispering words of comfort she herself did not believe. The mountain stretched endlessly before her, its peaks shrouded in threatening clouds that promised a storm she was ill-equipped to weather. Her thin shawl provided little protection against the biting wind, and her worn boots had already begun to split at the seams. Every step forward felt like a monumental effort, yet she knew that stopping meant certain death for both herself and her unborn child. As she stumbled along the narrow path, her vision began to blur from exhaustion and hunger. She had eaten nothing but wild berries for the past 2 days, and even those had become increasingly scarce as she climbed higher into this unforgiving wilderness. The baby's movements had grown weaker, and she feared what that might mean. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to give way at any moment. It was then that she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere beyond the next ridge. Where there was smoke, there was fire, and where there was fire, there might be shelter. Hope flickered in her chest like a dying ember suddenly given breath. She forced herself to move faster, ignoring the sharp stones that cut through her inadequate shoes and the branches that tore at her dress. The source of the smoke proved to be a modest log cabin, nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stand guard against the elements. Warm yellow light glowed from its windows, and she could see the silhouette of a man moving about inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, knowing that her fate now rested entirely in the hands of this stranger. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. She raised her fist to knock, but before she could make contact, the door swung open. The man who stood before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered hands that spoke of years spent working the land. His dark eyes took in her condition with a single glance: the swollen belly, the torn dress, the exhaustion written across her face like a map of suffering. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I have nowhere else to go." David Ortiz had always been a man of few words, preferring the honest company of his cattle to the complicated politics of human interaction. He had chosen this remote corner of the Montana Territory precisely because it offered him the solitude he craved, far from the judgment and expectations of civilized society. His ranch, carved from the wilderness through sheer determination and backbreaking labor, was his sanctuary, a place where a man could live according to his own moral code, without interference from others. The woman who now stood shivering on his doorstep challenged everything he thought he knew about his carefully ordered world. Her condition was obvious, and the desperation in her eyes told a story he had heard too many times before. Society had a way of punishing women for circumstances often beyond their control, while the men responsible walked away unscathed. It was a cruelty that had always sickened him, though he had never before been in a position to do anything about it. Without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The warmth of his cabin enveloped her like an embrace, and she nearly collapsed from the sudden relief. He caught her arm gently, steadying her as he guided her to a chair near the fireplace. The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of practical skill rather than aesthetic ambition. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "2 days ago," she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "Maybe 3. The days have begun to blur together." He moved to a small kitchen area without another word, returning moments later with a bowl of thick stew and a chunk of fresh bread. She ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had forgotten what it meant to feel full, and he watched her with the careful attention of a man assessing an injured animal. There was something in her bearing that spoke of strength beneath the obvious vulnerability, a quality he recognized and respected. "I am Judith Castillo," she said when she had finished eating, her voice stronger now that food had begun to restore her energy. "I do not expect charity, sir. If you will allow me to stay until the storm passes, I will work for my keep in whatever way I am able." "David Ortiz," he replied simply, "and there is no storm coming." She looked toward the window, confused, and saw that the threatening clouds had begun to dissipate, revealing patches of clear sky. "Then I was mistaken. I will leave at first light." "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. She had no answer because there was no answer. Her family had made it clear that she was no longer welcome, and she had no other relatives who would take her in. The father of her child had disappeared the moment he learned of her condition, leaving her to face the consequences alone. She was, in every sense that mattered, completely without options. "I do not know," she said finally, the admission costing her what little pride she had left. David studied her face in the flickering firelight, seeing past the exhaustion and desperation to the woman beneath. There was intelligence in her dark eyes, and a determination that reminded him of the wild horses he sometimes encountered in the high meadows, skittish and wary, but possessed of an inner fire that could not be broken by hardship alone. "Winter comes early in these mountains," he said after a long silence. "A woman in your condition would not survive a week alone out there." "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "You can stay," he said simply. "Work the ranch with me. Earn your place here through honest labor." The offer was more than she had dared hope for, yet she found herself hesitant to accept it. She had learned through bitter experience that kindness from strangers often came with a price she was unwilling to pay. "And what would you expect in return?" "Work," he said firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less. I need help with the cattle and the daily tasks of running this place. You need shelter and food." "It seems like a fair arrangement." She searched his face for any sign of deception or hidden motive, but found only the steady gaze of a man who meant exactly what he said. It was a foreign concept to her, a man offering help without expecting her to compromise her dignity in return. "I accept," she said quietly. The first weeks of their arrangement passed in a careful dance of mutual respect and cautious observation. David showed her the routines of ranch life with the patience of a teacher, never making her feel foolish for her ignorance of tasks that seemed second nature to him. She learned to milk the cows, tend the chickens, and help with the endless repairs that kept the ranch functioning. Her pregnancy made some tasks impossible, but she found ways to contribute that did not tax her physical limitations. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire in comfortable silence, he working on leather repairs or reading from one of his few books while she mended clothes or prepared vegetables for the next day's meals. Conversation was minimal but not uncomfortable. They were both people who understood the value of quiet companionship over empty chatter. As her belly grew larger, David began to take on more of the physically demanding work, though he did so without comment or fanfare. He simply adjusted the division of labor as naturally as he might account for changing weather conditions. When she protested that she was not pulling her weight, he reminded her that pregnant cattle receive extra care and attention, and she was no different. "You speak of me as if I were one of your animals," she said one evening, though there was no anger in her voice. "I mean no disrespect," he replied, looking up from the harness he was mending. "But animals understand something that people often forget. Survival depends on the strength of the herd. When one member is vulnerable, the others protect them. It is not charity, it is necessity." His words stayed with her long after they had retired to their separate sleeping areas. She had grown up in a world where vulnerability was seen as weakness to be punished, not protected. The idea that her condition might be viewed as something deserving of care rather than shame was revolutionary to her way of thinking. One morning in early October, she woke to find David already gone from the cabin. Through the window, she could see him in the distance, working to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. The sight of him laboring alone while she remained inside, growing larger and less useful by the day, filled her with a familiar sense of worthlessness. She made her way outside, moving slowly but determinedly toward where he worked. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and she could see her breath in small puffs as she walked. David looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "You should be resting," he said, though his tone held no reproach. "I have rested enough," she replied, picking up one of the fallen fence posts. "Show me what needs to be done." They worked together in the cool morning air, her movements careful but steady. She found that the physical labor helped to quiet the anxious thoughts that had begun to plague her as her due date approached. What would happen when the baby came? Would David still want her here? Could she really raise a child in this isolated place, so far from medical help or other women who might offer guidance? As if sensing her troubled thoughts, David paused in his work and looked at her directly. "There is something we need to discuss," he said. Her heart sank, certain that he was about to tell her it was time for her to leave. "Yes?" "The baby will come soon," he said matter-of-factly. "We need to make preparations." "Preparations?" "There is a woman in the valley, Barbara Bailey. She has experience with birthing. I will ride down and ask her to come when your time is near." The relief that flooded through her was so intense that she nearly dropped the fence post she was holding. "You would do that?" "Of course," he said as if the question surprised him. "Did you think I would leave you to face this alone?" She realized that was exactly what she had thought, because it was what everyone else in her life had done. Her family, the father of her child, even the church community that had once embraced her, all had turned their backs when she needed them most. The idea that this quiet mountain man would stand by her through the most vulnerable moment of her life was almost too much to comprehend. "Wait till we," she whispered, "but why are you helping me?" David was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the fence post as he considered his answer. "My mother died when I was 12, he said finally. "She was with child, and there was no one to help her when the time came. My father was away and the nearest neighbor was miles distant. I was too young to know what to do." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear it nonetheless. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I swore then that I would never let another woman face such a fate if it was in my power to prevent it," he continued. "That is why." November arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it snow that fell in thick, heavy flakes and winds that howled around the cabin like living things. Judith had grown large and uncomfortable, her movements slow and deliberate as she navigated the increasingly confined space of their shared home. David had ridden down to the valley the week before, returning with Barbara Bailey, a sturdy woman in her 50s who had delivered more babies than she could count. Barbara took one look at Judith and declared that the baby would arrive within days. She set up camp in the cabin's small spare room, bringing with her a collection of supplies and instruments that both reassured and terrified the expectant mother. David, meanwhile, threw himself into preparations with the same methodical attention he brought to all his tasks, ensuring that they had plenty of firewood, food, and clean water. The contractions began on a Tuesday morning, mild at first, but growing steadily stronger as the day progressed. Judith tried to continue with her normal routines, but by afternoon she was forced to admit that the time had come. Barbara took charge with the calm efficiency of long experience, while David retreated to the main room, though Judith could hear him pacing the floor like a caged animal. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day. There were moments when Judith was certain she would not survive, when the pain seemed too great to endure, and she found herself calling out for her mother, who was hundreds of miles away and would not have come even if she could have heard. It was during these darkest moments that she heard David's voice through the thin cabin walls, speaking to her in low, steady tones. "You are stronger than you know," he said during one particularly intense contraction. "I have seen you face down charging bulls and blizzards that would send grown men running. This is just another challenge to overcome." His words became an anchor in the storm of pain and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She focused on his voice, on the absolute certainty in his tone, and found the strength to continue. Barbara coached her through each stage of the process with patience and skill, never once making her feel ashamed or inadequate. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, the baby made its appearance, a healthy daughter with dark hair and powerful lungs that announced her arrival to the entire mountain. Barbara cleaned and swaddled the infant while Judith collapsed back against her pillows, exhausted but triumphant. "She is beautiful," David said softly when Barbara finally allowed him into the room. He approached the bed with the careful reverence of a man entering a church, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Judith's arms. "Would you like to hold her?" Judith asked, surprised by her own offer. David's hands, so capable with rope and tools and stubborn cattle, trembled slightly as he accepted the baby. She seemed impossibly small and fragile in his arms, yet there was something about the way he held her that suggested he would protect her with his life if necessary. "What will you call her?" he asked. Judith had given this question much thought during the long months of her pregnancy, but now, looking at her daughter's perfect face, only one name seemed right. "Joyce," she said, "Joyce Wood, after my grandmother." "Joyce Wood," David repeated, and the name sounded right in his deep voice. "Welcome to the ranch, little one." The winter that followed Joyce's birth was the harshest in recent memory, with snow falling almost continuously and temperatures that dropped so low that the water in the cabin's basin froze solid each night. Under normal circumstances, such conditions would have made life difficult for the small family. But David had prepared well, and the cabin remained warm and well-stocked throughout the long months of isolation. Judith marveled at how naturally David took to the role of protector and provider for both her and the baby. He had fashioned a wooden cradle with his own hands, carved with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of careful work. When Joyce cried during the night, he would often wake before Judith, checking to ensure that the fire remained strong and the cabin stayed warm. The rhythm of their daily life had shifted to accommodate the baby's needs, but they had fallen into the new routine with surprising ease. David would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check on the cattle, while Judith managed the household tasks and cared for Joyce. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, David reading aloud from his small collection of books, while Judith nursed the baby or worked on the tiny clothes she was constantly sewing. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Judith first broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. "David," she said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping baby in her arms, "what will happen when spring comes?" He looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I mean, will you still want us here? Joyce and me?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but she could not entirely hide her anxiety. "We have been a burden on you all winter. When the weather clears, perhaps it would be better if we found somewhere else to go." David closed the book and set it aside, giving her his full attention. "Do you want to leave?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected him to either confirm her fears or offer polite reassurances, not to turn the decision back to her. "I do not know," she said honestly. "This is the first place I have ever felt truly safe, but I do not want to impose on your kindness indefinitely." "It is not kindness," he said firmly. "You have more than earned your place here. The ranch runs better with your help, and Joyce—" He paused, looking at the baby with an expression of unmistakable tenderness. "She belongs here as much as any of us." "But what will people say when they learn of our arrangement?" Judith asked. "A unmarried woman living with a bachelor, raising a child that is not his? The gossip alone could ruin your reputation." David's laugh was short and humorless. "My reputation was ruined long before you arrived here. I am already considered an eccentric hermit by most people in the valley. What they think of my personal arrangements is of no concern to me." Despite his dismissive words, Judith could see that the question troubled him more than he wanted to admit. She had heard enough gossip in her own life to know how vicious it could be, particularly when directed at those who lived outside society's accepted norms. The last thing she wanted was to bring additional hardship to the man who had shown her such unexpected compassion. "Perhaps we could tell people that we are married," she suggested quietly. "It would not be true, but it might prevent the worst of the talk." David considered this proposal in silence for several long minutes, his gaze fixed on the fire. "That would make Joyce my daughter in the eyes of the law," he said finally. "Would that trouble you?" "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. "It would be an honor." The sincerity in his words took her breath away. She had spent so many months believing that Joyce would grow up as an outcast, marked by the circumstances of her birth. The possibility that her daughter might instead be raised as the cherished child of a respected rancher was more than she had ever dared hope for. "Then we will be married," she said, though the word felt strange on her tongue. "In name, at least." "In name," David agreed, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the arrangement might mean more to him than he was willing to admit. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it brought with it a transformation that seemed almost magical after the long months of winter isolation. The snow melted to reveal meadows carpeted with wildflowers, and the cattle emerged from their winter shelter looking healthy and ready for the grazing season ahead. Joyce, now several months old, had grown into a plump, happy baby who seemed to delight in the warmer weather and the increased activity around the ranch. David made the trip to town in early May, ostensibly to purchase supplies but also to spread word of his recent marriage to Judith. The story he told was simple and believable. He had met her during a trip to visit distant relatives. They had corresponded through the winter, and she had arrived in the spring with their young daughter to begin their life together on the ranch. Most people in the valley accepted this explanation without question, though Judith could see the curiosity in their eyes when David introduced her during their first trip to town together. She played her part carefully, speaking little but observing much, gradually building relationships with the other ranch wives who would be her neighbors and potential friends. Barbara Bailey proved to be a valuable ally in this process. Having been present at Joyce's birth, she could vouch for the timeline of events, and her reputation as a straight-talking, honest woman carried considerable weight in the community. She took Judith under her wing, introducing her to the other women and helping her navigate the complex social dynamics of frontier life. "You are fortunate in your husband," Barbara told her one afternoon as they worked together in her garden, Joyce sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. "David Ortiz has always been a man of his word. If he has claimed you and the child as his own, he will stand by that commitment no matter what challenges arise." "I know," Judith replied, though she sometimes wondered if David truly understood what he had taken on. "He is a good man." "Better than most," Barbara agreed, "but marriage is more than just legal arrangements and shared responsibilities. Have you given thought to what comes next?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Judith was not sure she was ready to face. Her arrangement with David had begun as a matter of survival, evolved into a partnership of mutual respect, and now seemed to be transforming into something deeper and more complex. She had caught herself watching him with increasing appreciation as he worked with the cattle or played with Joyce in the evenings, and she had noticed the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she was not looking. "I do not know what comes next," she admitted. "We have never spoken of it directly." "Perhaps it is time you did," Barbara suggested gently. "Winter will come again, and with it, the long months when you will have only each other for company. It would be wise to understand where you both stand before then." That evening, Judith found herself studying David with new eyes as he sat by the fire. Joyce balanced on his knee while he showed her the pictures in one of his books. The babe gurgled happily at the sound of his voice, her tiny hands reaching for the pages with the focused determination that seemed to characterize everything she did. Watching them together, Judith felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "She will be walking soon," David observed, catching Joyce's hands as she tried to grab the book. "We will need to make the cabin safer for a curious toddler." "Yes," Judith agreed, though her attention was focused more on the tender expression on his face than on the practical concerns he was raising. "David, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret the decision to take us in, to claim Joyce as your daughter?" He looked at her with surprise, as if the question had never occurred to him. "Never," he said firmly. "Why would you think such a thing?" "Because your life was simpler before we arrived. You had your solitude, your independence. Now you are responsible for a woman and child who are not truly your family." David was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on Joyce, who had managed to grab a corner of the book and was attempting to put it in her mouth. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "Family is not always about blood," he said. "Sometimes it is about choice. I chose to help you when you needed it most, and you chose to stay and build a life here with me. Joyce may not be my daughter by birth, but she is mine in every way that matters. As are you." The last three words were spoken so quietly that Judith almost missed them, but their impact was unmistakable. She felt her heart skip a beat as she realized that their arrangement had evolved far beyond the practical partnership she had originally envisioned. Summer brought with it a prosperity that exceeded David's most optimistic expectations. The cattle had thrived during the mild winter and abundant spring rains, and the herd had grown significantly through successful breeding and the addition of several prime bulls he had purchased from a neighboring ranch. The hay crop was the best he had ever harvested, and the vegetable garden that Judith had planted and tended yielded more food than they could possibly consume themselves. Joyce had indeed begun walking, much to the delight of both her parents, and her adventurous spirit kept them constantly on their toes. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's stubborn determination, a combination that promised both great achievements and considerable challenges in the years to come. David had constructed a small fence around the cabin's immediate vicinity to keep her safe while still allowing her the freedom to explore, and she spent hours each day investigating every rock, flower, and insect within her domain. The success of the ranch had not gone unnoticed in the valley, and David found himself receiving visits from neighbors who had previously paid little attention to the hermit living in the mountains. Some came seeking advice about cattle management or crop rotation, while others were simply curious about the woman who had transformed the notorious bachelor into a family man. Judith handled these social obligations with grace and skill, gradually establishing herself as a respected member of the community. It was during one such visit that the first real threat to their peaceful existence made itself known. Kevin Rodriguez, a wealthy rancher from the southern part of the valley, had arrived ostensibly to discuss a potential cattle deal, but it quickly became apparent that his interest lay elsewhere. "You have done well for yourself, Ortiz," he said, his eyes following Judith as she moved around the cabin, serving coffee and arranging chairs for their discussion. "A beautiful wife, a thriving ranch, a healthy child. A man could hardly ask for more." "I am fortunate," David replied carefully, not liking the way Rodriguez was looking at his family. "Indeed you are," Rodriguez continued, his gaze lingering on Judith in a way that made David's jaw tighten. "Though I must admit, I am curious about how you managed to keep such a treasure hidden for so long. Most men would want to show off such a prize." "My wife values privacy," David said, his voice carrying a warning that Rodriguez either did not hear or chose to ignore. Of course," Rodriguez said with a laugh that held no humor. "Though I wonder if she might not enjoy the occasional social gathering. My wife is planning a harvest celebration next month, and all the prominent families in the valley will be attending. Perhaps you would consider joining us." Judith looked up from where she was playing with Joyce on the floor, sensing the tension in the room, even though she had not been following the conversation closely. "That is very kind," she said politely, "but we rarely leave the ranch during busy seasons." "A pity," Rodriguez said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I had hoped to become better acquainted with such a charming addition to our community." After Rodriguez left, David remained unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. Judith could see that something about the visit had troubled him, but when she asked about it, he dismissed her concerns with vague assurances that everything was fine. It was not until several days later, when Barbara Bailey stopped by for her weekly visit, that Judith learned the true reason for David's unease. "You need to be careful of Kevin Rodriguez," Barbara warned as they worked together in the garden while Joyce napped in the shade nearby. "He has a reputation for taking whatever he wants, regardless of whether it belongs to someone else." "What do you mean?" Judith asked, though she had sensed something unsettling about the man during his visit. "He has been married 3 times, Barbara explained. The first wife died under suspicious circumstances, the second fled in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the third lives in terror of displeasing him. He is not a man who accepts refusal gracefully, particularly from women." A chill ran down Judith's spine as she remembered the way Rodriguez had looked at her, as if she were a prize to be won rather than a person with her own agency and desires. Surely he would not dare to interfere with another man's family. "He has done worse," Barbara said grimly. "There was a young woman in the valley several years ago, newly married to a homesteader who had claimed land that Rodriguez wanted. The homesteader died in what appeared to be a hunting accident, and the widow disappeared shortly thereafter. Rodriguez acquired the land at a fraction of its value, claiming the woman had sold it to him before leaving the territory. You think he killed the homesteader? I think Kevin Rodriguez is a dangerous man who has learned that money and influence can make inconvenient problems disappear, Barbara replied. And I think you and David need to be very careful. The harvest celebration that Rodriguez had mentioned took place in late September, and despite their initial reluctance, David and Judith found themselves attending at the insistence of several neighbors who assured them that their absence would be noted and commented upon. Judith dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a modest blue dress that she had sewn herself and arranging her dark hair in a simple but elegant style. Joyce, now walking confidently and chattering in the mysterious language of toddlers, wore a tiny dress that matched her mother's. The Rodriguez Ranch was impressive in its size and opulence, with a sprawling house that spoke of wealth accumulated through means both legitimate and questionable. The celebration was well attended, with families from throughout the valley gathering to mark the end of another successful growing season. Tables laden with food stretched across the main yard, and a small group of musicians provided entertainment for the dancing that would follow the meal. Rodriguez played the role of gracious host with practiced ease, moving among his guests with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. He was particularly attentive to Judith, complimenting her dress, praising Joyce's beauty, and making a point of introducing her to other prominent members of the community as if she were his own discovery rather than David's wife. Your husband is a fortunate man, he said during one such introduction, his hand lingering on Judith's arm longer than propriety demanded, though I suspect he does not fully appreciate the treasure he possesses. I am the fortunate one, Judith replied firmly, stepping closer to David and taking his arm in a gesture that clearly established her loyalty. My husband has given me everything I could ever want. Rodriguez's smile faltered slightly at this public declaration, but he recovered quickly, turning the conversation to safer topics. However, Judith noticed that his eyes continued to follow her throughout the evening, and she began to understand why Barbara had warned her to be careful. The evening took a darker turn when Rodriguez approached David near the end of the celebration, ostensibly to discuss business, but clearly with other motives in mind. I have been thinking about our conversation regarding cattle prices, he said, though they had discussed no such thing. I might be interested in purchasing your entire herd at a premium price. My cattle are not for sale, David replied evenly. Everything is for sale at the right price, Rodriguez countered. I am prepared to be very generous. Generous enough that you and your family could relocate anywhere you chose. Start fresh in a place where the winters are not so harsh and the isolation not so complete. We are happy where we are. Are you certain your wife feels the same way? Rodriguez asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. A woman of her obvious refinement might prefer the amenities of town life, the company of other cultured ladies. I could arrange for her to sample such pleasures, help her understand what she is missing in that remote cabin of yours. The threat implicit in these words was unmistakable, and David felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. My wife is perfectly content with our life, he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I suggest you focus your attention on your own family and leave mine alone. Rodriguez's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the surface. Of course, he said smoothly, I meant no offense. I simply hate to see such beauty wasted in isolation. The ride home from the celebration was tense and largely silent, with Joyce sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, while David guided the wagon through the darkness. It was not until they were safely back in their own cabin that Judith finally voiced the fears that had been growing throughout the evening. He means to cause trouble for us, she said as David tended to the horses. I could see it in his eyes. I know, David replied grimly. We will need to be careful. Perhaps we should consider his offer, Judith suggested reluctantly. Sell the ranch and move somewhere else, somewhere he cannot reach us. David turned to face her, his expression fierce in the lamplight. This is our home, he said firmly. I will not be driven from it by threats and intimidation. We have built something good here, something worth protecting. But if he is as dangerous as Barbara believes, then we will face that danger together, David interrupted. I did not save you from one form of abandonment only to abandon you to another. Whatever comes, We will meet it as a family. October brought with it an escalation of the subtle campaign that Rodriguez had begun against their small family. It started with minor inconveniences, gates left open that allowed cattle to wander, tools that went missing from where David had left them, supplies that failed to arrive when expected. Each incident could be explained as accident or coincidence, but the pattern was clear to anyone who cared to look. More troubling were the visits from strangers who claimed to be passing through but asked pointed questions about the ranch's operations, David's background, and particularly about Judith's history before her marriage. These men were clearly working for Rodriguez, though they took care never to admit as much directly. David answered their questions with polite but firm brevity, while Judith made sure to keep Joyce close whenever such visitors appeared. The psychological pressure was beginning to take its toll. Judith found herself jumping at shadows and checking the locks on the cabin doors multiple times each night. Joyce, sensitive to her parents' tension, became fussier than usual, crying more often and clinging to her mother with unusual desperation. David threw himself into the work of the ranch with increased intensity, as if physical labor could somehow ward off the threats that seemed to be closing in around them. It was during this period of mounting stress that an unexpected ally appeared in the form of William Phillips, a federal marshal who had been investigating Rodriguez's activities for several months. Phillips was a lean, weathered man in his 40s who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to facing down dangerous men. He arrived at the ranch on a cold morning in late October, his credentials clearly displayed and his purpose immediately apparent. "I understand you have been having some trouble with Kevin Rodriguez," he said without preamble after David had invited him inside for coffee. "What kind of trouble?" David asked carefully, not wanting to commit himself until he understood more about this unexpected visitor. "The kind that involves mysterious accidents, missing property, and veiled threats," Phillips replied. "The kind that has already cost at least 3 other families their homes and livelihoods." Judith looked up from where she was feeding Joyce, her attention fully focused on the conversation. "You are investigating him?" "I am," Phillips confirmed. "Rodriguez has been using intimidation and worse to acquire land and property throughout this territory. The problem is that he is very careful to cover his tracks, and most of his victims are too frightened to testify against him." "What do you want from us?" David asked. "Your cooperation," Phillips said simply. "I need witnesses who are willing to go on record about his threats and harassment. People who are not easily intimidated and who have the credibility to make their testimony stick." David and Judith exchanged a long look, each understanding the implications of what Phillips was asking. Agreeing to testify would make them direct targets of Rodriguez's wrath, but refusing might mean allowing him to continue preying on other innocent families. "What kind of protection could you offer?" Judith asked practically. "Limited," Phillips admitted. "I can arrange for periodic patrols in this area, but I cannot provide round-the-clock protection. You would be taking a significant risk." "We are already at risk," David pointed out. "At least this way, we might be able to put an end to it." Phillips spent the rest of the day documenting their experiences with Rodriguez, carefully recording dates, times, and witnesses to each incident. He also shared information about the federal investigation, painting a picture of a man who had built his empire through systematic intimidation and violence, always careful to maintain plausible deniability while destroying anyone who stood in his way. "There is something else you should know," Phillips said as he prepared to leave. "Rodriguez has been making inquiries about your wife's background, specifically about the circumstances surrounding your marriage and Joyce's birth. He seems to believe he has discovered some information that he can use against you." Judith felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. "What kind of information?" "I do not know the details," Phillips admitted, "but my sources suggest he has been in contact with people from your past, possibly including members of your family." The implication was clear and terrifying. If Rodriguez had somehow learned the truth about Joyce's parentage and Judith's circumstances before her arrival at the ranch, he would have powerful ammunition to use against them. In a society that valued reputation above almost everything else, the revelation that their marriage was a fiction and their daughter illegitimate could destroy everything they had built. "What do we do?" Judith whispered. We prepare for whatever comes, David said grimly, and we trust that the truth will be stronger than his lies. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Rodriguez arrived at the ranch on a gray November morning, accompanied by two men who were clearly hired muscle rather than ranch hands. David was working in the barn when he saw them approaching, and he quickly sent word to Judith to take Joyce in and lock the doors. Ortiz, Rodriguez called out as he dismounted from his horse. I think it is time we had an honest conversation about your situation here. David emerged from the barn slowly, his rifle held casually but ready for use if necessary. I have nothing to discuss with you, Rodriguez. Oh, but I think you do, Rodriguez replied with a cold smile. You see, I have recently learned some very interesting information about your lovely wife and her bastard child. The word hit David like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because of the venom with which it was delivered. Choose your next words very carefully, he warned. The truth is often uncomfortable, Rodriguez continued, clearly enjoying the moment. Your wife was thrown out by her own family for bringing shame upon their name. The child she carries is not yours, as everyone believes, but the product of her indiscretions with some man who wanted nothing to do with her. Your entire marriage is a sham designed to give her respectability she never earned. Even if that were true, David said evenly, it would change nothing. Judith is my wife, Joyce is my daughter, and this is our home. But it is not true, is it? Rodriguez pressed. You are harboring a fallen woman and her bastard child, deceiving the entire community about your circumstances. What do you think your neighbors will say when they learn the truth? What do you think will happen to your reputation, your business relationships, your standing in this valley? David felt a cold fury building in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. I think they will see a man who chose love over convention, compassion over judgment, and I think they will respect that choice. Will they? Rodriguez laughed harshly. Or will they see a fool who was taken in by a desperate whore looking for any man stupid enough to provide for her and her bastard? The insult was too much to bear. David raised his rifle, his finger moving to the trigger, but before he could fire, the cabin door burst open and Judith stepped outside, Joyce in her arms. Stop, she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority. This has gone far enough. Judith, get back inside, David commanded, not taking his eyes off Rodriguez. No, she said firmly, walking toward the group of men with her head held high. If this is about me, then I will face it myself. She stopped a few feet from Rodriguez, her dark eyes blazing with a combination of fear and defiance. You want the truth? Then here it is. Yes, I was cast out by my family for being with child outside of marriage. Yes, Joyce's father abandoned us both when he learned of her existence. And yes, I arrived at this ranch desperate and alone with nowhere else to turn. Rodriguez's smile widened, thinking he had won, but Judith was not finished. But David Ortiz did not take advantage of my desperation. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He offered me honest work, fair treatment, and the chance to rebuild my life with dignity. When Joyce was born, he claimed her as his own daughter, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He has been a better father to her than her biological father ever could have been, and a better husband to me than I ever dared hope for. She turned to face the small crowd of neighbors who had been drawn by the commotion, speaking directly to them rather than to Rodriguez. I am not ashamed of my past because it led me to this man in this life. I am not ashamed of my daughter because she is the light of our world. And I am not ashamed of our unconventional beginning because it has grown into something real and precious and worth defending. The neighbors who had come expecting to witness a scandal found themselves moved by her honesty and courage. These were people who understood hardship and the need to make difficult choices in order to survive. They saw in Judith not a fallen woman, but a survivor. And in David, not a fool, but a man of uncommon decency. That is a touching speech, Rodriguez said, though his confidence was clearly shaken by the response of the crowd. But it does not change the facts. This woman deceived all of you about her true nature. She deceived no one, Barbara Bailey said, stepping forward from the group of onlookers. I was present at Joyce's birth, and I have known the truth of their circumstances from the beginning. What I have seen is a woman who has worked tirelessly to build a good life for her family, and a man who has shown more Christian charity than most people who claim to be devout. Other voices joined hers, neighbors who had come to respect David and Judith for their hard work, their integrity, and their kindness to others. The tide of public opinion was clearly turning against Rodriguez, and he realized that his carefully planned revelation had backfired spectacularly. Faced with the collapse of his scheme, Rodriguez made one final desperate play. "You people are fools if you think this changes anything," he snarled. "I own half the businesses in this valley, and I can make life very difficult for anyone who chooses to stand with these liars." "And I represent the federal government," Marshal Phillips said, stepping out from behind the barn where he had been waiting with several deputies. "Kevin Rodriguez, you are under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and intimidation of federal witnesses." The arrest of Rodriguez marked the beginning of the end of his reign of terror over the valley. As Phillips had predicted, once one person was willing to stand up to him, others found the courage to come forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse. The federal case against him was overwhelming, and he was eventually sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. In the months that followed, David and Judith found their standing in the community not diminished but enhanced by the revelations about their past. Their neighbors respected the courage it had taken to stand up to Rodriguez, and they admired the strength of character that had enabled them to build a successful life together, despite the unconventional circumstances of their union. Joyce thrived in this atmosphere of acceptance and support, growing into a bright, confident child who was beloved by everyone who met her. She had David's steady temperament and Judith's quick intelligence, and she showed early signs of inheriting his skill with animals and her mother's gift for bringing people together. As winter approached once again, David and Judith found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had begun as strangers thrown together by desperation and necessity, but they had become something far more precious. A real family bound together by love, respect, and shared commitment to building a life worth living. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching Joyce play with the wooden toys David had carved for her, Judith broached a subject that had been on her mind for some time. "David," she said softly, "I want you to know that our marriage may have begun as a convenience, but it has become something real for me. If you would be willing, I would like to make it official in the eyes of God as well as the law." David looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I have loved you since the day you walked into my life," he said quietly. "I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it." They were married again the following spring, this time in a ceremony that celebrated not just their legal union, but their emotional commitment to each other and to the family they had created together. The entire valley turned out for the celebration, which was held in the meadow behind their cabin, with wildflowers blooming all around them, and the mountains standing guard in the distance. As they exchanged vows, Judith thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a woman with nothing, cast out and abandoned by those who should have protected her, but she had found something better than the acceptance she had lost. She had found a love that was chosen rather than expected, earned rather than assumed. Joyce, now a sturdy 2-year-old, served as an enthusiastic if unofficial flower girl, scattering petals with abandon while the adults laughed and applauded. She had no memory of the desperate circumstances of her birth or the threats that had once endangered their small family. To her, David had always been her father, Judith had always been her mother, and the ranch had always been her home. Years later, when Joyce was old enough to understand, Judith would tell her the full story of how their family had come to be. She would speak honestly about the mistakes and hardships that had preceded their happiness, but she would also emphasize the courage and compassion that had made their unconventional beginning possible. "Your father chose to love us when he had no obligation to do so," she would say. "That makes his love more precious, not less. And it teaches us that family is not just about blood or law or social expectations. Sometimes it is about recognizing the people who belong with you and having the courage to claim them as your own." The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management, growing from a modest operation into one of the most successful in the territory. David's skill with cattle and Judith's talent for organization and community building proved to be a powerful combination, and they became known throughout the region as people who could be trusted to keep their word and stand by their principles. They faced other challenges over the years: harsh winters, market fluctuations, the occasional conflict with neighbors or competitors, but they met each obstacle as a united team, drawing strength from their shared commitment to the life they had built together. Their love story became something of a legend in the valley, proof that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings could lead to the most enduring happiness. As the sun set behind the mountains on their wedding day, casting long shadows across the meadow where their guests were still celebrating, David and Judith stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching Joyce chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The baby who had once seemed like such a burden to others had become the joy of their lives, and the desperate woman who had arrived at their door with nothing had become the heart of their home. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not found your cabin that night?" Judith asked, leaning against David's strong shoulder. "No," he replied without hesitation, "because you did find it, and everything that followed was exactly as it was meant to be." She smiled at his certainty, remembering the fear and desperation that had driven her up that mountain path so long ago. She had been running from shame and rejection, but she had found something infinitely more valuable than the acceptance she had lost. She had found a place where she could be valued for who she was rather than judged for what she had done, and a man who saw her strength rather than her vulnerability. Their story was not the fairy tale that young girls dreamed of, with its perfect prince and instant transformation. It was something better, a real love built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and the daily choice to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. It was the kind of love that could weather any storm, because it had been forged in the crucible of genuine adversity and proven strong enough to overcome even the most determined opposition. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside to put Joyce to bed, beginning another evening in the life they had created together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but they would face them as they faced everything else, together as a family, proud of what they had built and confident in their ability to protect and nurture it for years to come. The mountain that had once seemed like a place of exile had become their sanctuary, and the desperate flight that had begun in shame and fear had ended in love and belonging. Sometimes, Judith reflected, as she tucked her daughter into the cradle that David had made with his own hands, the most beautiful destinations could only be reached by the most difficult paths.